His first instinct was to drop down right where he stood. It wasn't fear that brought him to the ground, and it wasn't shock from what lay before his eyes. It was the way that single moment out there in the merciless heat, under a sky so impossibly blue it seemed unreal, finally shattered what remained of his faith in humanity. A young woman was bound to a weathered wooden stake like livestock. Her face was hidden beneath a burned piece of cloth, and the rope had carved so deeply into her flesh that her wrists had taken on the dark hue of old blood. No screams escaped her lips, no tears fell. She barely stirred at all. It was as if the desert had held her captive, so long that she'd lost the memory of how to plead for rescue. The wilderness was merciless during those months, parched beyond measure, eerily still, scorching enough to strip flesh from bone if you remained motionless. Too long. And this unfortunate soul had been motionless far longer than anyone should endure. His approach was measured, cautious. The kind of movement a person makes when unsure whether they're walking toward salvation or death. Each knot he loosened seemed to carry fragments of some unspeakable history. The quiet that stretched between them wasn't hollow, it overflowed with truths that defied language, truths that men only voice when drawing their final breath. Then she uttered words that would echo in his mind, longer than any other memory. "Please don't judge me when you see." When he drew back that cloth, he managed not to recoil, but his knees gave way and he collapsed into the dust. What had been inflicted upon her transcended mere brutality. It was calculated malice, crafted to strip away her humanity and ensure no soul would ever meet her gaze again. Yet her eyes remained undeniably human, still beseeching not for rescue, but simply for someone to recognize her personhood once more. That recognition destroyed him completely. Here was a woman cast aside by society, condemned for sins she'd never committed, and a man who believed himself beyond feeling, suddenly awakened to life by this stranger's presence. There in that cursed stretch of wasteland, wrapped in silence and crushing heat, a shattered soul encountered a lost spirit. For an instant, the entire world seemed to pause, and that was merely the opening chapter. He bypassed the sheriff's office. He avoided the town entirely. Instead, he brought her to his dwelling, or what had once served as a home. Nothing more than a deteriorating shack nestled in the foothills beyond Bisbee, a location no one visited anymore. Too many spirits lingered there, too many painful recollections. The structure featured a crumbling veranda, a corroded wash basin, and a single chamber that still carried the scent of a woman who'd departed a decade prior. He hadn't disturbed her side of their shared bed since illness claimed her life. That evening, he placed the girl there with infinite care, as though sudden movements might cause her to crumble. She remained mute, never requested water, shed no tears. She simply gazed upward at the wooden planks as if she remained bound to that desert post beneath the blazing sun. He provided bread, fresh cloth, and a water pail, then retreated to the porch to stare into nothingness. Come morning, the food had vanished. The fabric showed signs of use, and the water level had dropped, but the looking glass stayed hidden. That aged mirror positioned above the washstand, the one he'd neglected to clean in years. She'd managed to drape it with a towel. She refused to confront her own reflection. The following afternoon revealed her clutching a sewing needle, fingers trembling, attention fixed on a fabric remnant. She wasn't actually stitching. She was simply gripping it, as though the recollection of how to mend things was the sole fragment of her identity that remained intact. He offered no words, asked nothing about her ordeal, didn't even inquire about her identity. That's when her voice returned, weak and parched, yet more distinct than before. "If I can still recall how to sew," she whispered, "does that prove I'm still human?" He provided no response, simply rose and exited the room. Upon his return that evening, a sewing hoop sat beside the bed, along with folded fabric, pristine, ivory, unmarked. 7 days passed in mere silence. Neither spoke much. But a person can only endure quiet for so long before reality begins seeping through. The truth emerged gradually. Small details she accidentally revealed when assuming he wasn't paying attention. A name occasionally, a location sometimes. By the third evening, he'd assembled enough fragments to understand the complete picture, and it made his rage burn hotter than the Arizona sun. Her name was June. She'd served as domestic help for the county magistrate down in Tombstone. The magistrate's offspring wasn't accustomed to hearing refusal more than once. When she threatened exposure, they ensured her silence would be permanent. Rope in the wilderness. The law itself was the magistrate. That revelation crystallized Elias's resolve. He realized he wasn't simply preserving a stranger's life. He was sitting atop an explosive situation. So he prepared his horse. The following dawn, June awakened to discover the cabin vacant and the sound of hoofbeats disappearing into the hills. By midday, Elias stood framed in the entrance of the Crystal Palace Tavern. The magistrate's son occupied a table there, sharing laughter with companions, intoxicated by whiskey and arrogance. Elias never reached for his weapon, never elevated his voice. He simply placed a folded white cloth on their table, the same fabric June had held while lying in bed. The establishment fell completely silent. "You recognize who this belonged to," Elias declared. No response came, but the expression on the young man's face revealed the truth to everyone present. Justice isn't always about gunfire. Sometimes it involves ensuring everyone sees a person's true character. By the time Elias departed, not a single patron in that saloon would associate with the magistrate's son again. If you've followed along to this point, you've likely realized this transcends a simple tale about the frontier. It explores what a person decides when the simple path is to turn away. So if you're curious how this concludes, remain here and perhaps consider subscribing. There's still more to share. News spreads rapidly in small communities. And in Tombstone, it moves even faster when connected to the magistrate's reputation. By evening, people weren't just murmuring about the incident at the saloon. They were discussing Elias as well, how he'd entered unarmed and left. The magistrate's son appearing as though he'd consumed poison. The magistrate took offense. Men of his position always do. 2 evenings later, Elias sat on his porch honing a blade he had no intention of using when he detected approaching horses, 3 riders, moving swiftly. June remained inside, stitching beneath lamplight. She remained unaware. He noticed everything. The first man through the entrance was massive, large enough to obstruct half the available light. The second wore a cruel smile and reeked of cheap alcohol. The third was inconsequential. "For now, the magistrate requests your presence," announced the large intruder. Elias remained motionless, silent. Then the alcohol-soaked fool committed his error. He moved toward June and seized her arm. Events unfolded rapidly. Elias captured his wrist, twisted with sufficient force to fracture bone, and sent him face first into the wall. The man struck the floor before comprehending what occurred. The large man reached for his belt too slowly. Elias forced him back through the doorway, boots scraping against the porch planks, one movement away from drawing his Colt. But the weapon proved unnecessary. "Inform your employer," Elias said, breathing calmly. "If he wants her, he can travel here personally, and he'd better prepare to meet her gaze directly." The large man offered no reply, simply assisted his companion, and all 3 vanished into darkness. But retreat doesn't always signal conclusion. Inside, June continued sewing. Elias resumed his position on the porch. Some conflicts aren't resolved through violence. Sometimes victory comes when the opposing party departs knowing they're unwelcome. The night following the rider's departure, the desert regained its quietude, but something within June had transformed. She no longer startled at every noise. She began leaving the mirror exposed. Some mornings Elias discovered her on the porch, stitching in the early light, exactly as his deceased wife once had. Days became weeks. The cabin, previously just shelter for memories, started feeling vibrant. Again, she repaired worn clothing, cultivated herbs behind the house, even chuckled when the mule attempted stealing her bread. Elias never pressured her to speak, but one evening, as sunset painted the hills, she expressed her desire to remain, not from fear of leaving, but because she finally felt like more than simply the terrible thing that had befallen her. He acknowledged her words with a nod, and they returned to observing the sky. People believed the frontier was constructed with firearms and precious metals. Reality shows it was built mostly through quiet gestures of preserving someone's life long enough for them to rediscover themselves. Perhaps someday she'd depart, perhaps not. But the next girl who appeared at that porch with identical hollow eyes wouldn't need to wait as long for compassion. That's the nature of difficult times in this harsh land. They can destroy you, or transform you into the person who helps others rise again. What would your choice be? Abandon them or remain and share their burden? If this narrative resonated with you, maybe it's because you've experienced your own challenging periods. Perhaps you've walked in June's shoes or found yourself in Elias's position. Regardless, these frontier stories remain relevant because they demonstrate that even in landscapes filled with dust and violence, compassion can still flourish. So, if you'd like to hear more tales like this, stories that blend toughness with tenderness, go ahead and tap that like button and subscribe. It costs nothing and keeps these flames alive so we can journey into our next adventure together.